refresh this page. Here only it should come. Shit, I am on camera. Shit, I am on camera.
You are sharing the video.
Yeah, but they have to click and come to this page only. Going live now, please follow us, something like that. Going live. हाँ ಬರ್ತಿದೆ.
There is a little pickering because
Is there any filter?
Okay, share it.
ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಫ್ಲಿಕ್ಕರ್ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ ಅವರೇ, ಫ್ಲಿಕ್ಕರ್ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ, ಈ ಥರ ಆಗ್ತಾ ಇದೆ.
ಏನಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ಹೇಳ್ತೀನಿ. ಪಬ್ಲಿಕ್ಗೆ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿರೋದು
ಮತ್ತು ನನಗೆ ಯಾಕೆ ಬರ್ತಿರಲ್ಲ?
ಬರಬೇಕಲ್ಲ
ಸರ್ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿರೋ ಅನ್ಸುತ್ತೆ ನೀವು.
ಈಗ ನೀವು ಓಪನ್ ಮಾಡಿ
ಜಸ್ಟ್ ಓಪನ್ ಮಾಡಿ ನೋಡ್ತಿದ್ದೀನಿ. ನೋಡಿ ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ,
ಅಲ್ಲಲ್ಲ ಅದಲ್ಲ ಅದೇ
ಅದೆಲ್ಲ ಸೆಕ್ಷನ್
GST ಸೆಂಟರ್ ಫಾರ್ ಪಾಲಿಸಿ ರಿಸರ್ಚ್ ಮತ್ತು ಟೈಪ್ ಬರುತ್ತೆ. ಓಕೆ ಆದರೆ ಇದು ಈಗ ಲೈವ್ ಇದೆಯಾ? ಪಬ್ಲಿಷ್ ಆಗ್ತಿದೆ ಅಲ್ವ? ಮತ್ತೇನು ಚೇಂಜ್ ಆಗ್ತಿದೆ? ಓಕೆ ಕವರ್ ಆಗಬೇಕಿತ್ತಲ್ವ ಇವಾಗ? ಈಗ ನಾವಿಬ್ಬರು ಬರಬೇಕಲ್ಲ. ಓಕೆ
ಕ್ರೌಡ್ ಅಲ್ವಾ, ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ 1 ಸೆಕೆಂಡ್.
ಓಕೆ ಬರ್ತಿದ್ದಲ್ಲ ನಿಮಗೆ? Hello.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all here, and thanks for coming and showing interest in this topic. And today's panel discussion is about equitable access to knowledge, and this panel discussion is part of the International Open Access Week activities that we have planned at IISc campus. And these events are conducted in collaboration with a few organizations like groups in and around IISc. DST Center for Policy Research, joining hands with the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore, NIAS, and we have Karnataka State Library Association on board for these activities, and JRD Tata Library at IISc is a main partner in this week-long International Open Access Week activities. In addition to that, our newly created Science Policy Group. You could find the members here, and there is a help desk also to answer your queries about the group. So today's panel discussion will be moderated by Pranesh Prakash from Center for Internet and Society. He's a fellow there. Before he was a policy director, a founding member of that organization, which is Bangalore based. And just to give a brief introduction about his interest, he has a special interest in the convergence at the intersection of technology, culture, economics, law, and justice. His current works focuses on interrogating, promoting, and engaging with policymakers on the area of access to knowledge, openness, government open data, and freedom of expression and internet governance. Without further ado, because we are here to listen to them, so I hand it over to the moderator of this panel, Pranesh. He may start introducing the panelists, and then he'll continue the discussion. Yeah. Floor is yours, Prakash.
Now it's working. So thank you very much for that introduction, Jagan. And I would urge all the people sitting on this side of the room to try to move over here to the center so that all of us can see you better and so that you can hear all of us better. I'm very honored to be here today for this session during Open Access Week 2018. Now, I don't want to introduce the general topic of access to knowledge and why the quest for equity is actually at the center of open access as a movement, as a strategy, and so on. I think the panelists are far better to do that. And so all I would do is, as they start before their initial provocations, I will introduce them, and we are hoping to keep the panelists speaking to around 45 minutes or so in order to leave ample time for audience interactions. So start noting all your questions and all your comments and so on while the panelists are speaking, and we will have plenty of time to carry on discussions. First off, it's my pleasure to introduce Carl Malamud, sitting here to my left. Carl is the president of public.resource.org. It's a non-governmental organization based in the US. He is credited with putting several large governmental databases on the internet for the first time, including the US patent database, and has fought for many years on other kinds of databases, including legal case databases, in which he recently had a victory just last week in court. He works actively in India, where he is engaged right now in a PIL to make Indian standards available to the public at no charge. And if you go to the public resource website, you'll already find a large number of the BIS standards on it right now. He's the author of 9 books, most recently Code Swaraj, co-authored with Dr. Sam Petroda. And Carl is also possibly the only person I know who would end up in a pub in Bangalore while reading a 1,000-page tome biography of Gandhi, as he did last week. So, off to you.
Well, thank you, Pranesh. Long press. I do computers for a living, so I never read the manual. Thank you, Pranesh, for that introduction. I want to thank Professor Runachalam and Mr. Basha for inviting me and organizing the event today. So I'd like to talk about open access. And I think you can divide open access to scientific information, which is what I'm going to focus on, scientific journals, into two categories, which is going forward and looking back. So going forward, many journals are becoming open access. Even the large predatory publishers like Reed Elsevier are beginning to open up a little bit. They're realizing that open is the only way to go. But when we do research, we stand on the shoulders of giants, and you need the previous archive. And that's a huge problem. That's a big problem. I do some work at JNU, and I know that JNU spends more money accessing journal articles than they do on supporting all their graduate students combined. I know universities like Harvard have had to cut back on access to journals because the prices have gone up and up and up and up. It used to be they were sort of reasonable because they were small print runs and that was the only way to get them. But ironically enough, as the internet came into being, the prices started going up. And the profit margins started going up. Reed Elsevier has a higher gross margin, 40%, than Google does. They are more profitable on scientific publishing. So I want to address the elephant in the room, which is that there is open access already to the journals that have been published, and that is a system called Sci-Hub. A young student, a Kazakh student, Alexandra Albakian, put together Sci-Hub. She was in Kazakhstan. She was trying to do her research, like many people in India and China and Africa and the United States and the United Kingdom. She was unable to access the journals she needed, and she put together a system, which is a pirate system. It has 71.3 million PDF files on it. India is the second largest user of Sci-Hub. China is the largest. But the United States and the United Kingdom are in the top 10 as well. Now, I did a study on works of government. In the United States, if you are a federal employee, you are not entitled to copyright. And I had noticed that President Obama had published an article in the Harvard Law Review, and the Harvard Law Review was asserting copyright over that. It was a wishy-washy copyright, but it was very clear that you could not use this article without their permission. And so I did a study. I found 1.2 million journal articles by federal employees. Now, whether or not they were in the course of their official duties, it's hard to tell, right? Because if you go home and write a journal article and don't use federal facilities, and you just do it totally on your own, you can have copyright. And so we pulled 10,000 of those articles out for manual examination. And what was very clear is almost all of them had a copyright assertion on them. Many of them were clearly in the course of their official duties. Many of them were behind paywalls. And we did this research at the University of North Carolina. Many of those articles were not accessible to students at the University of North Carolina. These were not obscure journals. These were mainstream journals by mainstream publishers. My point is that there's a lot of articles behind the paywall, in Sci-Hub, in the corporate sites, that don't have copyright, and yet they are being held hostage. There was a study at the University of Pennsylvania. Again, in the United States, you had to renew your copyright before 1963. And what they found is that very few journal publishers renewed their copyright. In other words, those journal articles are not under copyright. A lot of Sci-Hub is information that should be in the public domain. I find it ironic that information has become colonized, and it is especially ironic that it is UK corporations, that it is Reed Elsevier, Oxford, Cambridge, Francis and Taylor, as well as a lot of very rich scholarly societies that are holding knowledge hostage. It is ironic that scientists are the new indigo farmers, that they work with raw materials. Journals are the new railways, that you ship those materials to England. You then have to buy back those high-priced finished goods, and you have no choice. And to me, Sci-Hub is an unlicensed salt factory on the edge of the ocean of knowledge. This is not a situation that can keep going. Not only do individuals not have access, there is life-saving research that cannot be done today. Big data is the wave of the future. You go through large amounts of text and you look for, you do text mining, artificial intelligence. You cannot do big data today on the corpus of all scientific journals. You cannot go to Reed Elsevier, you cannot go to the publishers and say, listen, I have important research I would like to do, because they turn you down. People have asked. They said, let me have all your journal articles because I want to save lives, I want to advance knowledge. And they say, no, we have a contract you will need to sign. It'll cost a lot of money. I want to close by talking about something called the Essential Facilities Doctrine. This comes out of antitrust. Essential Facilities says that if there is a monopoly, and there is an abuse of monopoly power, there is some facility that is essential to doing things, and there is no physical reason that you have to preclude access. So if you're an electrical company, right, and there's a hospital out there and you're refusing to sell electricity to that hospital, that is the Essential Facilities Doctrine. I believe that publishers have become an essential facility, that they have abused their monopoly power, that there is a bottleneck, and that in particular big data research on the scholarly corpus is something that not only can be done, it should be done, and it would be legal to do it. And so that's the elephant in the room, is Sci-Hub, and I believe that's something that needs to be addressed. Thank you.
I'd love to talk more about that during the open audience session. Thanks, Carl. Next, we have Professor S. Nayana, who's with the Center for Public Policy at the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. Professor Nayana was a professor at the Center for Public Policy, IIM, from 1986 to 2017, and was earlier with the IISc from 80 to 86. And her areas of specialization, I should say, include elementary education, literacy, university and technical education, and vocational education and skills development. She's a Fulbright scholar. She was is an associate editor and member of several professional bodies, and was a member of the Knowledge Commission in Karnataka. And her research as well as advisory engagements are directed towards strategy planning, monitoring and evaluation, and she's been consultant to a number of organizations, including the World Bank. With no further ado, Professor Nayana is going to speak about open access policies, and apart from one of her passions, which is cricket, and watching cricket, she spends her time volunteering at a school for the disadvantaged nowadays.
Thank you. Good afternoon. At the outset, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to be here to share a few thoughts of mine on open access. And I must say, Professor Basha's skills at persuasion are excellent. He wouldn't take no for an answer. So here goes. So we find that historically, the Budapest OA initiative has been, been there for a very long time, and the kinds of content and so many other things have been, been a public good so far as our country is concerned. As per the SJR, this is something which I think we should take note of. India ranks 9th
It's in the.
Oh, it is?
It's just this arrow will go there. This
No, no, it can't enlarge.
that way.
Presentation mode, is it?
This is the presentation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, go to
Is
the
it
next.
fine?
Yeah, it's hardly visible, that's why I'm saying.
Just a minute, I'll try something else. Okay, this is the presentation. Okay.
That's fine. Thank you. So our country ranks 9th as far as their ranking goes in the year 2016, producing about 13 lakh articles. However, we find that 82% of them are not, anyway, they are not in the open access. So this is, I think, is a matter of concern. And the institutional repositories in India are sparsely populated in spite of having open access mandates in place.
I can just stand here and do this for you if you want.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure.
Whenever you say next, I'll just press.
Yeah. Go to the next slide. So what is interesting, according to me, is that the Delhi Declaration on Open Access was adopted in 2018, and it clearly... Wait.
No, it's here because you should not touch this area.
No, I didn't.
Okay, fine. Yeah.
It clearly urges the scientists and scholars to flip their journals information to open access and to contribute to the development of open access journals in India and garner support of the relevant stakeholders for this purpose. So this is something which I think we need to immediately take note of. Well, I think the other speakers are going to talk at length about open access itself, but what I really thought was and important was for us to look at some of the issues which need to be discussed, debated, and see what needs to be done taking this OA further. One is the first issue that I thought was very critical was regarding inclusiveness. Now, how can the various stakeholders have access to this information in the absence of good connectivity? Firstly, we are presuming that everybody has access to the kinds of internet and other things which will enable them to access scholarly journals, articles, and what have you. Especially those in remote urban areas where connectivity is a grave problem. For example, and the people who are differently abled, who are disadvantaged, who cannot afford to have these kinds of web connectivity and so on. Now, how do we provide help to such people to enable them to access this kind of information? For example, we at IIMB are twice blessed, I must say, and highly privileged. We can get access to any kind of information, any journal, anywhere in the world, but are everybody blessed in that same fashion? So how do we look at inclusiveness as we go further? I think this is something which I would request all of you to pay a lot of thought going further. Number two, what kinds of works can be part of OA? Should it be only, this research articles, scholarly material, or can government reports, documents, vast data, conference proceedings, etc., and statistical information be part of OA? Many a time there is this confidentiality clause. The government does not allow us to access information. I have found it extremely difficult because all my life I have worked with the government. And any time we prepared any reports or we came up with some statistical information, there was a ban. They said, no, you can't publish this. You can't put it out anywhere. This becomes our property. Every bit of information should be given to us, blah, blah, blah. So, how do we access such information? In fact, if we have to bring about certain reforms, it becomes very essential for us to get that information across so that scholars, experts across the globe can put their thoughts and come up with some viable solutions. So this is something which again, I would like you to look at. Then, how does this policy, OA policy, address intellectual property rights issue? I think this is now becoming a very, very important question in everybody's mind. It involves a lot of legalities, legal issues. So how do we, address this question of IPR, the copyrights, and so on and so forth? Then what should be the author's safeguards in OA? Now, we just, for example, the scholars give it to the kinds of publishers to put it out in OA, and then supposing there is some litigation, something objectionable and so on, where does it leave the scholar? Are there enough safeguards? What kind of agreements should we sign? What should we look at? Instead of being novices in this direction, I think all of us need some kind of exposure, some kind of training, being educated about what it entails. So I just wanted to place these issues before you, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Nayana, for expanding the scope of the discussion, for bringing in not just the issue of cost, which is the kind of equity that open access largely tries to address, but also issues of access by persons with disabilities, accessibility, including the issue of just plain infrastructure in the form of connectivity, as well as bringing up IPR-related issues, which I think there being some lawyers here, we can at least have a discussion later. Next, I would like to have a person who is not present in the room right now, but who will be joining us not just in spirit, but through a video presentation that he has sent earlier, and that will be the journalist Richard Poynder. Those of you who have worked in and have gone and searched online for anything related to open access would know Richard Poynder, who's written not present in the room right now, but who will be joining us not just in spirit, but through a video presentation that he has sent earlier.
Sorry.
Okay, so that's the live stream that's going on in YouTube, in case some of you want to watch this online right now instead of being present. But yeah, so all of us have read articles by Richard, who's been covering this area for, I think, close to a decade and a half or 2 decades or so. And he's an independent journalist and blogger specializing in information technology, scholarly communications, professional online database service, open science, IP, and so on. Richard Poynder has been observing and reporting on the evolution of open access movement for 15 years now, and has been variously praised, criticized, and threatened as well. Leading open access scholar Stephen Harnard, who I believe coined the phrase open access, has described Richard as the chronicler, conscience, and gadfly laureate of the open access movement. And now the hear and go through Richard's slides.
Thank you for inviting me to give a presentation for Open Access Week on the topic of designing equitable foundations for open knowledge. We'll clearly want to discuss what we mean by equitable foundations for open knowledge, but perhaps the first question to ask is why it has become a pressing issue now. In 2002, the Budapest Open Access Initiative promised that open access would accelerate research, enrich education, share the learning of the rich with the poor and the poor with the rich, make this literature as useful as it can be, and lay the foundation for uniting humanity in a common intellectual conversation and quest for knowledge. The question is that what we see today with open access? Let's recall that in Budapest, 2 roads were outlined for achieving open access. The first was green open access, also known as self-archiving. Here, the idea was that research institutions and universities would create institutional repositories so that researchers could post their papers in those repositories and make them freely available on the internet. However, most researchers spurn using their institutional repositories, preferring instead to use for-profit proprietary services like ResearchGate and academia.edu. This is a puzzle. Meanwhile, publishers began imposing embargoes before self-archived papers could be made open access. As a result, we've seen ever more oppressive open access policies introduced by universities and research institutions and by funders, and yet still researchers generally ignore these policies, leaving librarians to do the depositing, if it takes place at all. The second road outlined at Budapest was gold open access, also known as open access publishing. Now, I know open access advocates will say that most open access journals do not charge an APC, but the reality is that most of the journals, open access journals that researchers want to publish in, do charge an article processing charge. So what we've seen is the rise of pay-to-publish article processing charges and the rise of predatory publishing. We've also seen the rise of hybrid open access and thus double dipping. Here I mean that in a hybrid journal, institutions carry on paying subscriptions, but when a researcher wants to make their paper open access in one of those hybrid journals, they have to pay an article processing charge. In short, the transition to open access is proving slow and very expensive. So where are we today? Open access want to dramatically speed up the transition to open access. They also want immediate open access with a CC BY license attached. For this reason, gold open access is generally preferred. But many researchers can't afford to pay APCs, not least those in the Global South. What this means is that paywalls are simply being replaced by publication walls. This obviously has implications for any kind of global conversation. Additionally, many researchers, especially non-scientists, dislike CC BY, not least those in the Global South. For this reason, last year we saw a number of Latin American organizations issue the Declaration of Mexico, which calls for CC BY NCSA to be the norm. We could also note that non-profit publishers and learned societies dislike both APCs and CC BY. They also believe that embargoes are necessary for their survival. Nevertheless, European research funders want to push ahead, and they've announced Plan S. The goal is that after the 1st of January 2020, scientific publications on the results from research funded by public grants provided by national and European research councils and funding bodies must be published in compliant open access journals or on compliant open access platforms. Now, I don't know what open access platforms is implied here, but if you look at the principles of Plan S, one tends to form the view that it might be difficult. These open access platforms won't be the route that most will take. Europe wants to see the rest of the world sign up to Plan S. In fact, unless most countries do sign up, it's likely that Plan S won't succeed. Plan S is controversial for a number of reasons, not least because it threatens to make pay-to-publish gold on open access the norm while banning hybrid OA. So what does this mean for the Global South? And what does it mean for academic freedom if 85% of the journals researchers currently use become non-compliant overnight? Global Young Academy issued a statement recently in which it suggested there were two possible outcomes to Plan S. One, a flourishing scientific and knowledge ecosystem. Two, a scientific dystopia. Given the time involved, that is 2020 is really quite close now, the second option, the second future seems more likely, to me at least. We might at this point want to go back to basics and ask what is the purpose of open access? Is it to solve the accessibility problem? In other words, make research available outside a paywall? That seems obvious, but we have to remember that a lot of people signed up to open access, especially librarians, because they saw it as a way of solving the affordability problem. That is, reducing the soaring cost of scholarly publishing, notably subscription big deals, which have become a monster. So we might want to ask, can both these problems be solved by open access? Can they be solved in a way that ensures less wealthy institutions and countries are included and enfranchised in the way that BOI promised? One might want to compare, for instance, the principles of Plan S alongside those of OCSD's NET's Open Science Manifesto and ask whether they're compatible. I'm not sure they are. So, is a global open access solution possible? If not, what are the consequences? How can humanity engage in a common intellectual conversation and quest for knowledge, given that the way open access is currently developing? We might also want to ask if open access is enough. I say this because publishers anticipated the likely implications of open access for them some years ago, began moving upstream in the research life cycle, developing large platforms and workflow solution products that some fear will lead to a different type of increasingly expensive lock-in to the subscription big deal that now dominates and is seen to be so pernicious, and thus lead to a new affordability problem. For this reason, we're seeing calls for open research infrastructures. The fear is that without open infrastructures, open access could become moot. Meanwhile, open access cannot address the problem of access to legacy paywall content, which will remain locked away for so long as the copyright in that content exists. It seems that in an open access world, there will be publishing costs in addition to access costs, which has clear implications for the Global South. So what should countries in the Global South do? I don't know. I don't have any answers. One development we are seeing is national licensing deals being signed with legacy publishers. In Uruguay, for instance, they've done this in order to create the Timbo portal. And in Egypt, we've seen the same thing with the Knowledge Bank. These national licensing deals are signed with legacy publishers to provide access to all their content. Moreover, this content is available not just to all the researchers in that country, but to every citizen. In effect, therefore, they do provide open access. And as time goes on and more research becomes open access, one could envisage the cost of these licensing deals falling, but who knows? The problem, however, is that in a pay-to-publish gold open access world, publication walls will remain. Once again, we have to wonder how the global conversation can take place if those in the Global South cannot afford to have to publish their own research. Thank you for listening to me. I'm hoping the questions that I've asked will help frame the discussion today.
Excellent. So that presentation really got us into some of the nitty-gritties of the kinds of issues that we're facing today with open access. Everything from the question of journal quality versus predatory publishing, and where the divide really lies between predatory publishing and other kinds of publishing. Some people reject even the label predatory publishing, to the kinds of questions on IP that Carl already raised about legacy material and how we have open access, and the question of APCs as well. Lots, I think, to think through. including, I think, I would like to bring up later the issue of preprint repositories, which wasn't addressed, and how that could also be one potential future. But before I raise those questions and invite the audience for theirs, let's hear from the next panelist. This is Professor Arul Scaria, who is an assistant professor of law and co-director of the Center for Innovation, Intellectual Property and Competition at National Law University in Delhi. He's also an affiliate faculty with the CopyrightX program run by the Harvard Law School, and he did his doctoral research at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, and his postdoctoral work at the UCL in Belgium. His key areas of interest and specialization are science and technology policies, open movements, IP laws, and competition law. And he's currently working on projects in the area of open science, open innovation, and regulation of digital markets in the context of big data, AI, and IoT. Today he'll be speaking about some of his research on open science. And apart from all his academic achievements, Professor Scaria is also an avid trekker.
To be on this campus, and more so when it is for discussing an extremely important topic like open access with some of the best researchers and also some of the most active, I would say, practitioners in this particular area. I would also like to thank the former speakers for flagging out some of the most important issues that we need to address in this regard. And maybe I should start from one of the questions where I think Richard was ending his presentation. So that is, what should the countries in the global south do? And I would slightly reverse that question and ask ourselves, are we as a country doing enough in this particular area? Are we actually looking at the serious issues that might have to be looked at in the broader context of the open access movement? So in my presentation also, I don't have many answers, but I thought there are some questions that we might want to ask as we move ahead with this particular movement. So one of the basic questions, which I think is not just limited to open access, but basically limited to the production and consumption of science, is whether the current ecosystem is inclusive and equitable. And as we all know, unfortunately, that's not the case with the current ecosystem of production of science, because if you look at the current system, we will see that there are many kinds of biases that are existing. For example, there are serious biases existing against women. One example which I have put here is with regard to the possibility of women getting a grant application success. The other example could be their own chance of getting promotion in their career. Even more would be the issue of getting their work published in a reputed journal. So there are different kinds of bias existing in that area. Another thing which I guess many people have been highlighting in the last week is something which we all should be really ashamed of. In the history of Nobel Prize, has there been even one instance where a black scientist has been awarded Nobel Prize? Unfortunately, no. Of course, there have been some in the area of peace and literature. I think even that is coming only to around, I think, 13 or so out of the total 900 that has been granted. And isn't it a matter of shame for us that we are not seeing a Nobel laureate in that direction? Of course, when we look at India, we might even encounter other more complex issues like caste-based or religion-based discrimination. But of course, things doesn't end there. Being researchers from the global south, we even face other kinds of bias, which I would use the words of Professor Arunachalam, the Harvard-Hyderabad syndrome, which I am sure at least some of you are familiar with, or for those who are not familiar with, the concept says that if a researcher from Harvard and Hyderabad sends in the same work to the same journal with the same quality, the chances of the person from Hyderabad getting accepted are much, much lesser. That's a reality which we need to address. And this reality has to be addressed in the context of the open science or the open access movement also. So in this context, we need to ask ourselves whether we as a country or we as researchers are doing enough. And I would like to present some data, which of course is disappointing and which was collected through a survey which we conducted as part of the Open Science project at the Center for Innovation, IP and Competition at National Law University, Delhi. So I don't want to go to the methodological details. You can actually search for this report online and you will have the complete report as well as the complete data set. But I would like to highlight some of the data from this particular report. So, not surprisingly, most of the respondents in our survey said that they use publications as well as data which are available in the public. But when it comes to sharing their publications, as you can see here, only 36% of those people who access publications which are available in public shared their publications. When it came to data, it went even down and only around 32% shared their data. If you look at the way people are sharing, at least in the case of our respondents, as you can see here, only around 35% of the respondents said they will be sharing the publications through open access repositories. And when it came to data, only around 8.41% said they will be sharing their data through open access repository. With regard to data, as you can see, most of the people wanted to share the data only with their team, which means people want to retain their exclusivity. And is that something which we should promote? That's something which we need to ask ourselves. With regard to the factors that dissuade people from sharing their publication through open access modes, we could see that article processing charges, which Richard highlighted during his presentation, and also which has been highlighted by the works of Madan and Professor Arunachalam, plays a major role. So interestingly, it says that at least some people do not want to pay article processing charges, whereas at least a substantial segment is also unable to pay article processing charges. And as Richard was rightly pointing out, many of the researchers from the global south will not be able to pay the article processing charge. And so if you are going in that direction in the open access movement, unfortunately we will be further calibrating the exclusion which is currently existing. And when it comes to the factors discouraging sharing of data through open access modes, as you can see here, the most important factor which has been highlighted is people are saying they can share the data only when all the potential research on that particular data set is completed. And as everyone who is sitting in this room would agree, there is no phase in the life of a researcher wherein they would feel that all the potential research is over. So that means they will keep the data set for their lifetime. Do we really want to promote that, particularly for public funded research? This is something, again, we need to ask ourselves. We also discussed, Pranesh briefly touched on the issue of access of the materials for people with disabilities. So we also tried to inquire whether the institutions are trying to take measures for making the information accessible for people with disability. And as you can see here, the vast majority said they don't know, which clearly indicates that the institution is not taking any specific measures. And when we also asked what kind of facilities are available, as you can see here, while things like ramp facilities have got better, maybe thanks to different legislation that are in place, things like audiobooks and braille textbooks are provided only by very few institutions. Again, this is something which is clearly excluding people with disabilities from the knowledge generation process. This is also something which we should ask ourselves whether we should promote such an approach. Since open access is not just about sharing research with people who are your peers, but also to make science a participatory process, we also need to understand whether we are taking enough efforts to make science accessible for the public. So in this particular regard, again, we tried to ask the researchers whether they used to share simplified version of their research. And unfortunately, as you can see here, the vast majority said they never or rarely shared their research in simplified versions. India is a multilingual country with more than 22 official languages, so we also tried to ask them whether they used to at least provide a translated version of their major findings. And as you can see here, most of the researchers never ever shared. Of course, we as researchers have serious disrespect for informal science, but by excluding also the communication of science to people in their language, we are completely eliminating their participation in the scientific research process. Again, this is something which we need to ask ourselves in this particular open access week. The last question which I would also like to highlight is something Professor Tara was trying to highlight during her presentation. Many a times, or in most of the discussions on open access, people are taking it for granted that everyone has really good access to internet. Unfortunately, that may not be the case in most of the countries in the global south. So when we talk about open access or open movement, if you really want to make it inclusive, if you really want to make it equitable, we also need to discuss about the different steps that can enable the open access movement in the offline context. This might include strengthening the library network and maybe introducing more activities like the open day at IISc. Of course, IISc is an exception there. And for example, in the case of law schools, I don't know even a single law school having an open day. So we might have to also think about such measures if we really want to make the open access movement really inclusive and equitable. So these are just some of my initial remarks, and I really look forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Wow, that's a lot of hard data to really back up some of the concerns that we've been addressing. Thanks, Arul. And next, we have Dr. Shahid Jameel, who is an Indian virologist and CEO of the Wellcome Trust DBT India Alliance, known for his research in the hepatitis E virus. Dr. Jameel is an elected fellow of all three major Indian science academies, and he's also been awarded by the CSIR as with the Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Prize for Science and Technology, one of the highest Indian science awards for his contributions to medical science in 2000. Apart from this, Dr. Jameel is also a history buff and is trying to improve his photography skills, especially in the area of wildlife. So, Dr. Jameel.
Thanks, Pranesh. You know, the bad thing about speaking last is that everything useful has been said. On the other hand, one could pick the important points, and one doesn't need too much intelligence to summarize those. So that's why I'm at the very end. So let me start by asking this question: what do publishers really do? I mean, we researchers produce the research, we write the papers, those are sent to us for peer review, we edit the journals, we buy the journals, our libraries store those journals. What do publishers do? The profit margin is around 30 to 40%, which is one of the highest in any business. It's a $25 billion business, publishing. So I think that's where all of us are coming from. The second point I want to touch upon is that public funding of research demands that the public should know about the research. That's not just open access, but that also places a lot of responsibility on us as scientists to not just sit in our ivory towers, but go out and communicate our science to the public, which very few of us actually do. And Arul touched upon lay summaries. How many of us have really gone out to explain what this very technical paper says in terms of a lay summary? So it's this whole attitude that what I am doing is so important that nobody can and nobody should understand it. And it's really a self-defeating exercise, because science, at least in India, is supported largely with public money. And unless the public understands what we do, the public will not support it for very long. And slowly you see that happening. Slowly you see that public money for research is getting less and less. So that's something else that we should be thinking about. Richard's slide presentation and his talk very clearly laid out the two open access models, the green open access and the gold open access. Arun, it was about 2015 that DBT and DST set up the policy, around 2015. So India's policy is a green open access policy. DBT set up a committee to provide a report, and on that basis, DBT and DST both came out with a declaration that they would support green open access, which means that institutions need to have repositories, and any paper that has been accepted should be deposited in those repositories, and then search engines would pick those papers and they would become largely open access. The question is, how many institutions in India have actually followed that process? I asked this question to Arun about an hour back, and he already produced the data on that. And the data is that 20 DBT institutions have repositories, 12 institutions have contributed papers in that repository. A total of 3,810 papers are available in institutional repositories, out of which the National Institute for Plant Genome Research in New Delhi with 877 papers is the highest. Pretty pathetic score. So how should we improve it? I think having a policy is very good, but implementing that policy, enforcing that policy is equally important. So to starters, I would say that if DBT and DST have the stated policy, they should at least go to their own autonomous institutions and say, look guys, unless you have a repository, your next year's money is not going to come. It's very simple. That's what works. When you send me an annual report, send me data on how many papers your people have published and how many of those have been uploaded in your institutional repository. Something very simple to do, unfortunately, hasn't been done. And in the same line, I wonder how many papers from IISc go into an institutional repository. I'm sure IISc has a repository, but I wonder what percent of papers that... Right. But again, what percent of papers go in the repository is something that some of you who are curious may want to check. So the next point I would come to is what we follow at the Wellcome Trust DBT India Alliance, or India Alliance for short. We follow gold open access. We are guilty of allowing the double dipping. Yet from where we come from is that we want to make information open access. We work in the same environment which everyone does. So, but on the other hand, we do promote open access to information. And that's why we pay our fellows to make their papers open access. I mean, you can say that's good, that's bad, that's elitist, that's this, that, whatever, but that's how it is. Question is, why do we do that? We do it because, for all the same reasons, we want to make information available, we want to become more exclusive. More inclusive. And, making papers open access is not the only inclusive thing that we do. I mean, we do many other things. For example, the science communication workshops where we take science to the public. We do ask our fellows to write lay summaries of their work. When they come to the fellows meeting, they don't just write a technical abstract, but they also write a lay abstract. So those things we do. Another important thing is this whole issue of women in science and the leaky pipeline that we have been talking about. And we are the only funding agency in the country that actually extends the grant at full cost for a year if one of our fellows goes on maternity leave. So these are the kinds of provisions we have to bring in inclusivity, to bring in, to promote people, build their careers, and I hope that other funding agencies would follow these. Wellcome Open has come up as a very interesting publishing platform. We became members of Wellcome Open very recently, and I was just going through it today, and I can see almost a dozen papers by India Alliance Fellows already up on Wellcome Open. And this is a completely open platform where you write your paper and you put it in. You suggest the reviewers. All the reviews are open. All the rebuttals are open. Everything is open. All the data is open. As far as compliance goes, yes, we do seek reports from our fellows at the end of the year. What have they published? Have they made it open access? We have now become members of Euro PMC, so we are also asking our fellows to upload their papers on Euro PMC, so they are now equally accessible. So in the end, I would say that I think for any of this to be successful, thinking has to change. Individual thinking as well as institutional thinking has to change. There was very brief mention of preprints. And again, I think we are the only ones in the country who have gone on record to say that preprints will be considered as research in progress and would be taken into account as research data when we are assessing people for our fellowship, as well as when we are assessing fellows' progress during the course of the fellowship. So, institutions need to step up and use similar provisions and not just say that, if you've not published 5 papers in impact factor 5 or above, don't apply to us. This is still happening in India. Advertisements are actually coming out saying if you've not published so many papers and so much impact factor, don't apply to us. Those things need to disappear. So I would simply end by asking whether institutions themselves are doing enough and if there is scope to do much more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jameel. I think a large number of issues have been raised, and we have overshot our time slightly, but I believe we still have around 30 minutes for discussions. And I'd just like to quickly lay out some of the issues that came up on the question of equity and open access, issues of gender, issues of money, infrastructure came up, internet access, language, accessibility for persons with disabilities, knowledge and specialization and the asymmetry of these, as well as the asymmetry between the global north and the global south, not just in terms of infrastructure and money, but also in terms of influence in a way also came up. So that's a very many different kinds of asymmetries to consider, to think about how do we bridge these and how do we lessen these and how do we make it make things more equitable. A few legal questions came up. The question about government copyright, which in the US there is no government copyright, or there isn't, at least in theory, and sometimes it has to be fought in courts to establish that there is no government copyright. It's all in the public domain. But in India, we do have government copyright. So the government does have copyright over works that it funds, over the works of its employees done in the course of their government employment, and so on. And so far, even in 2010, when the Copyright Act was being amended, we at the Center for Internet and Society, along with 21 other organizations, submitted our comments, our submissions to the amendment process. And one of the suggestions was to actually do away with government copyright by having a very large exception to the use of copyrighted material, and say that under most circumstances, most citizens should be able to use works that they have funded through their tax money. And yet that amendment was not accepted by the government, and without any reasons being given. The question of legality of preprint repositories comes up once in a while, and I think there ought to be some amount of clarity in the research amongst researchers on that question, which, given that it comes up frequently, there isn't any clarity. The question of one other question that has some legal angle to it is the question of weeding out the kinds of journals that misrepresent their processes, that say that we provide peer review, whereas without doing any kind of peer review. And there was an expose of one such journal just last week in India. And so how do we tackle these kinds of journals which misrepresent what they do to researchers? And other questions of utility of open access, such as the inability to simply explain what does the research show to journalists. Right now, this is not, let me express that differently. This isn't an inability on the part of researchers, but rather sometimes the unwillingness and sometimes the lack of institutional capacity, because in many places you have science communication people working alongside scientists, but in many institutions in India, those kinds of offices just aren't present. Is the data available for verification of the results? Are the data published? Now, very often, as Professor Scaria's research shows, the data just aren't published alongside the main research article, making the question of validity of the research more difficult to ascertain. And very importantly for laypersons like myself, the question of how trustworthy is the research is the paper that I'm reading. For instance, I've not seen any efforts towards saying, has this study been reproduced, right? So even if the study has been reproduced, there's no easy way for a layperson to find out without going through many other articles, looking through who's citing whom, and doing all kinds of arcane searches, which just aren't in my capacity really to do. And so the question of how do we actually make the research accessible to the public still, I feel, is an open question, and not just to the public, I mean to media as well. And so with this kind of a brief summary, I'd like to throw it open to the audience. Questions, comments, and with your questions and comments, could you please do three things. One, introduce yourself. Two, make it brief. And three, if possible, please address it to a specific person. We'll collect a few in one go, and then we'll try to answer them. Show of hands.
My question is to both Professor Shahid and Professor Arul. I'm Dr. Akshay from PCMS Research, Bangalore. I'm practicing as a physician and a clinical researcher. So, where you ended, sir, you mentioned the open access repositories built by DBT and other institutions like that. How one thing that the publishers, I do believe that publishers add value to the ecosystem, wherein they make the possibility of blinded peer reviews and all the streamlining the publication, this thing, and making even the impact factor which you said should not be counted is actually a measure of quality of the work. How do you say which paper is actually worth reading or which paper can be trusted? So publishers do actually add value, and like Arul mentioned, if you're talking about translation from one this thing to other, it can't be upon to the researcher to translate things. Publishers will have to help there. So how can DPT just making a repository where people can submit their maybe after publishing to a journal, publishing it to the repository, it doesn't remove the journal again. And how does it help? I mean, or is there anything else we can do to actually engage in an open access publishing platform kind of thing?
Could we take a few questions in a row and then answer them? I think that might be more proper.
Hello, I am Padmini Ray Murray. I head the master's program in digital humanities at the Srishti Institute for Art, Design and Technology. My question is to Mr. Malamud, but also to Richard, who's obviously not in the room. And I think one of the elephants in the room that we're not addressing is search and the role that it plays in exposing knowledge, right? And I don't know whether it was a intentional use, but you said, standing on the shoulder of giants, which of course is Google Scholars' byline. And I think or tagline rather. And what's really interesting is that Google is by its processes, kind of making invisible a lot of scientific research. And there's actually, his name escapes me, but the person who founded Open Maps, he's actually started a project called Don't Leave It to Google, which is about kind of trying to kind of explode the stranglehold that Google has on search. And I think one reason why people are putting material on academia and the ResearchGate, for example, is because it gets picked up in Google results. And I think in the age of the precarious academic, also when people are working, so we're obviously not seeing a full spread of what's out there. And so I wonder whether there needs to be kind of a better way, and I think both us as users and creators have to think about the way we tag material. I think metadata is a big problem. And also, how do we kind of ensure that more scientific research is being picked up and recognized in ways that Google might not be?
Yeah, I'm Sai Baba from National for Advanced Studies here. My question is general. While we're discussing about open access, we're somehow not touching the ecosystem of publication. What we're trying to do is that we're allowing the current method of publication to be like that, and then you say that we give access free to it. I mean, this is where I think we have to address this issue. I think Dr. Shahid just mentioned about the initiative of Wellcome Open. I think it has to be really looked into the way we want to publish our papers. And he just mentioned about the valuing that publication. I think there should be a system of Wikipedia equivalent people coming forward to review it. And nowadays the moment of reviewer comments also to be made public is also happening. And reviewer comments should be made public. That would also give a value to the system. I think unless otherwise we address the ecosystem of publication, we would keep on discussing this about making it access. Because somebody is working for making money and you are telling them making it open to others, why would he listen to it? In fact, I want to add another syndrome to what Hyderabad Harvard syndrome is, our own way of not publishing our papers in our own journals. If you do a survey of Indian publications appearing in Indian journals, it will be dismally slow. That means we are inherently accepting that something else is better. I think we have to address these issues. Unless otherwise we address these issues, I think we'll have these open access weeks every year, discuss, raise, and we'll continue to do so. I think we need to ponder about the way we are publishing and the way we are allowing the system. In fact, Richard mentioned, in the short term, it has become expensive for us now. Open access has become a problem for us because predatory journals have come, you have to pay for it. So you see what is happening here. What is started as a good is becoming disadvantaged for us. I think I would say that these are things we should contemplate if you really want the knowledge to be accessible to all the people.
So I think we'll take one more question and then come back and then go back to the audience.
This is Vasu Deshpande from a software company working in the library space. I was wondering, when publishers are making about 40% profits, have the universities themselves tried to form a consortia and then become a publisher by themselves and then give the open access? Thank you.
Well, I mean, Cambridge University Press and Oxford University Press are no better. So to answer your question, you know, I did want to provoke by saying, what do publishers do? Of course, publishers do something, and that's why they're making all that profit. So, yes, they bring value, but they're really, what do they do more than marketing? Is it fair that research that is funded with public money goes behind a paywall, and the benefits of that research is not accessible to the public? I don't think that's a fair system at all. There was a statistic that I was seeing somewhere that, you know, papers published in the New England Journal of Medicine, 40% of papers published in New England Journal of Medicine are published from within 100 kilometers or 100 miles of the journal office. So, you know, publishing itself, this whole thing has become a big boys club. And you know how expensive it is to subscribe to New England Journal or Lancet or any of these medical journals. Groundbreaking discoveries come out in those journals, but they remain behind paywalls. So that's the point I'm making, that whether it's money from NIH in US, which is public money, or it's money from the Ministry of Health in India or DBT or DST, it's public money. So if information goes behind paywalls, it helps no one. Right now, that's the acceptable model, and publishers bring value, but tomorrow there may be an alternate model. And I think that's why we are here, we are discussing that.
Let me address the Google monopoly issue. So look, I know Anurag Achara actually does Google Scholar. He's the guy that started it. It's a beautiful system. He's done a great job. They pay for access to a lot of the data that they index. And if you go to Reed Elsevier and you say, I want to index your journals, they say, no, you can't do that. And when you have one large search provider and only one provider of access to data, be it Reed Elsevier or the American Chemical Society or the American Geographic Society, all these scholarly societies and very rich publishers are prohibiting use. And when you have that, you're going to only have one style of indexing, and you're going to have biased results. Bulk data should be available. Places like ResearchGate should be able to have copies of the journals and expose them in different ways. Just like other people, any grad student ought to be able to download the entire scholarly corpus. It's not that hard. Sci-Hub is about 56 terabytes. You can do that today, right? It's a few $100s for an 8 terabyte disk drive. There is no reason that a grad student shouldn't be able to download it and expose it. The internet is not based on a cloud. It's an end-to-end principle. It's an end computer. Anybody can put a web server up on their laptop. And it's only these artificial barriers on access to information that are prohibiting new ways of accessing and using that information. And that's got to change.
Okay, so I just wanted to address one of the important questions he raised, that was who will pay for the translation, right? So I guess, and also for, I guess, making simplified versions of research. So there are two things which can be done. One is providing incentives to the researchers themselves to make simplified versions. I think DST has recently started something called IISc. I think that's the name of that particular project, wherein it is incentivizing young scholars to produce a shorter, simplified version of their research findings, and I think if it qualifies, I think you get like 10,000 rupees or something for that particular piece. So that's one model which we can actually follow. The second thing I think which would be a bit more complicated is the case of translation. So there, of course, I am sure that most of the people who are sitting in this room may not be able to translate into more than one or max might be two languages. So there we might have to actually allocate funds for doing this. And ideally that funding should be coming from the funding agency. And as Professor Jameel was pointing out earlier, we should always remember that most of the research in India is funded by public agencies, and they can of course allot a small part for the translation also. It's not a big deal. If you take into consideration the amount they are investing for a particular research, I don't think it would cost much more to make a translated version. We could also do one more thing. For many of the researchers, maybe just getting the credits for the translation might be sufficient. So we can also say that for the translated version, you get the authorship. Of course, you give credits to the original researcher. So that's also another model which we may want to explore. But the core challenge here is making researchers aware of the fact that it is important to communicate in language which is accessible. But unfortunately, I think that step hasn't happened. And I think if that awareness happens, I think rest all will fall in place. That's my take on that. Thank you.
A few more hands that I saw.
And just one small thing to add on the consortia thing. So maybe I think that's also something which I was thinking of addressing. So traditionally, at least in India, there were many universities which were having presses of their own. Unfortunately, even though I think starting a press for a university has become easier because thanks to the digital technologies, I think most of them have actually stopped moving in that particular direction. So I think your suggestion was a really good one. Even if they're not going for consortia, at least at university level, maybe we can have university presses which can disseminate the work of the researchers, particularly the monographs, without any additional cost or restriction. So that's something which we should definitely take into consideration, and that's a great suggestion.
So three hands up, 1, 2, 3, 4.
My name is Nagraj. I am from Raman Research Institute. My question is to Professor Karl. Is this Sci-Hub illegal? If not, how long this will sustain? And elsewhere has already filed a case on Elbakin. And on one end, publisher is charging, and Sci-Hub is giving it free. So I want to know the reason for this and how long the Sci-Hub would sustain in such a circumstance.
And could I also urge the women in the audience to ask questions, because it's not...
Okay, that was very timely, so I got to speak out of turn. Just to say actually that we seem to be marked by real lack of ingenuity, given that we're supposedly the more highly educated people in the country. It's been a while that we've been talking about open access, but I don't see the formation of, say, a consortium to even come up with a wish list in terms of what we want to see as a publisher's contract. So we sign increasingly more pernicious contracts. So for instance, I've signed something which will copyright my work over technology that has not yet been invented, right, at lower royalties than I was paid 10 years ago. But I don't see the formation of any sort of cooperative among academics to try and say, well, this is the sort of contract we want to see, right? And the other thing, I think Sai Baba raised this question of, I don't think the ecosystem is being addressed really. So universities in India have actually worsened their policies in terms of the way that they rank journals. So you would have had a generation of Indian academics who didn't want to subscribe to the, everything foreign is better policy and would have published in Indian journals and are now probably in their 50s and find that university policies have turned against them, where there's actually more weightage given to American journals. So you're really caught between universities and publishers, and you really need some sort of formation or collective, apart from, technical questions or policy questions, some kind of collective formation that would address that.
Question is to Professor Jameel. You mentioned this Wellcome Open. Is that a journal?
Yes.
Okay. if so, then that is likely to become a fairly a good model for disruptive innovation in the field of scholarly publishing, don't you think? Because right now it says you can submit and it gets published right away, and it is open to post-publication peer review, and it comes with its own DOI, and it can be cited and so on. Then that could be a model for something like what Professor Sai Baba mentioned. I mean, wiki-based model where you submit something and then you open it up for post-publication. Is that something that Wellcome did? What was the thought process behind this Wellcome initiative?
So let me just address that question. Yeah, so I think Wellcome, first of all, has very deep pockets, so they can explore many things, which many others can't. So they started this, again, with this idea of offering an alternate platform instead of just funding publishers to make things open access. And it's also a very open model. But I think the success of that model really depends upon how the community takes to it. Right now it's very limited. It's only limited to Wellcome funded researchers. So that's important to know. But I think in future, if this, they are really very surprised at the success of this. They had done some estimations as to how many papers would come on it on an annual basis. And I'm told the number has exceeded that by about 4-fold or 5-fold. So it's obviously a very successful model, but the eventual success would be if, how the community accepts it. Whether IISc would hire somebody who was published only in Wellcome Open or not. No, so that's how, at the end of the day, an academic is publishing to get a position, to get promotions, all that. So does the community accept it? And I think that would be important to see.
This is Anand Pal from Department of Physics. My question is little different actually. Now it's fine. I want to ask, like, when we are doing research, why we are so much focused on publishing? Whether whole research is a business of publishing or it's something else. As a physicist, I understood it's much more about adding the knowledge. So why don't we have some system like GitHub? It's very successful in the software development. And it's direct to give you evaluation also. Like if you recognize one problem, and I'm working on superconductivity, and 100 institute or 50 labs in India working on same sample. So point is that, and they are producing the same data. Sorry, I will sit and then I will continue my question. So point is that 50 labs doing the same measurement, producing the same result. Same result in some different journals, and they all are funded by public money. If you have something like a GitHub, where you define the problem, everyone who contribute in this to development to solve this problem, and to adding something knowledge, it would be directly evaluated by public and directly evaluated by researcher there. Because if we go to GitHub and like stake exchange and all those things, is easy to evaluate. That problem, like Professor Said Jameel asked now only whether IISc hire someone who published in Wellcome Journal, that will be solved there. But that's my question, why we are so much focused on this thing, why we are not going, okay, we recognize some problem, when DST or DBT fund some research, and then they put some thread, and there everything can be added, and everyone can read that. And it's good for new researcher also to identify the problem where he are interested and he can contribute. Sorry if I'm too long.
I hope there aren't any more questions because, okay, can we extend time for tea a little bit? Yes. So can we extend tea by 10 minutes? 10 minutes is okay. For you as well, like for everyone? Okay. So in that case, let's quickly pick up these two questions and then we'll have a closing round of comments by the speakers.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kripa Shankar. I am the second year MTech research student from IISc. So I have recently joined the research community. So my question is that I agree that these publishers are charging us money, but they are also giving, aren't they also giving back to the society? I mean, they are sponsoring the conferences. They are organizing the summer school for the people, new students to get introduced. Are we looking at only one side of the coin, that they are only charging the money, and it is said that we are publishing the results, we are buying our own research?
I have a very simple question, which I think Carl will probably be able to answer. The Internet Archive gets away from a lot of copyright issues because they are registered as a library. So how does that option not work for journals?
Excellent. Thank you for the questions. Now, final round of comments from the speakers.
Okay, so very quickly on the library thing, yes, libraries can make information available. Under Indian copyright law, if a teacher provides a student material in the course of their instruction, copyright does not apply. We are not using that in India. Is Sci-Hub illegal, and how long will it sustain? I have to ask you, is an abuse of monopoly power illegal? Is knowledge knowingly encroaching on public property with intellectual property assertions of copyright illegal? I think those are the wrong questions. I think the right questions are who owns knowledge, who pays for it, who may access knowledge, is access to knowledge a human right? Is the progress of science a moral imperative? Is Sci-Hub illegal is like asking, was making salt illegal? Yeah, it was illegal to make salt, but it turned out it was right. Will Sci-Hub sustain itself? I don't know. Will we have universal access to human knowledge in our generation? I think that's up to us. We just have to make it happen.
So I just wanted to answer one of the questions, very important questions she raised, that is, how do we address the issue of the restrictions which are seen in many of the contracts? Particularly, I think she highlighted one very common thing which we can see in the publisher contracts, that is assignment to even to technologies or technological platforms which are not in existence at the time of the contract. So thanks to the efforts, I would say, from the composers, in 2012 we made an amendment and we very clearly included in the Copyright Act that such kind of assignment shall be void. So that kind of assignment is not at all a valid assignment under the Indian Copyright Act. But the problem is we are still seeing many contracts like that within the film industry and also outside. And how do we address that particular issue? There I do have a feeling that maybe instead of consortium, I think there is one set of people who can actually play a very important role there, that is the librarians in this country. If I understand correctly, in the US, what makes things really different is the role librarians in each of the universities play in communicating what is permitted under copyright law and what is not permitted under copyright law, particularly your rights as a user under copyright law, the fair use rights or whatever we call it. But unfortunately, that hasn't really happened in the Indian context. Unfortunately, many of our librarians are influenced by, or at least completely driven by, the knowledge given by the publishers. And it is because of that we see that these kinds of contracts continue to exist or continue to be imposed on many of us. So maybe we need to start educating our librarians, and maybe through them we should actually push back against such kind of contracts. So that's one thing which I wanted to.
And there's one thing I'd just add to that. If what you're doing is being funded by the government, then there's a very high chance that the government actually owns copyright, that you aren't free to contract away that copyright to a publisher. So you might, like, you can't give away something that isn't yours in the first place. So many of these copyrights that foreign publications and even Indian publications, publishers, have been entering into with Indian researchers actually need to be investigated to see whether they have any legal standing in the first place. Sorry, just have to add that.
I would like to endorse what Arul was saying. I think just like most cases, I'm not trying to generalize, but like with the doctors, the medical, what do you call it? Yeah, pharma representatives. The doctors are driven by the kind of information being given by the pharma reps, and they keep on prescribing medicines. So likewise, our librarians are also influenced by the kind of publishers who keep on giving them all kinds of information. So I really feel that there is a need to educate our librarians and help them to push back and get some adequate information regarding the publication of our papers, number one. Number two, again, I feel accessibility for people who are in really remote areas and those who are differently abled. These are the kinds of people we need to find some way to support them, probably through CSR of various industries. Maybe some people can volunteer to go to such places and to set up certain centers where they can access these kinds of scholarly articles that are available and help these researchers who are working in rural areas. They really have a great problem, as I have seen. And number three, what was said earlier, I think if we can release the copyright issues from the government and see that many of the information that we collect as part of the government funded projects are those which are commissioned by them, I think that would go a long way in helping people to get the kinds of information that will be most useful. Thank you so much.
So I think that's a very useful point that you made, that how can you give away copyright when it doesn't even belong to you? And I think most of us don't think of it that way. I think we've done the research, it's my copyright. It's not. The government has funded it. But you know, the government also doesn't enforce that. And I come back to the point that, you know, you have an open access policy, a stated policy, and if you're not going to enforce it, the compliance is going to be 30%, as Arul showed in his data. The last thing I want to say is that I think institutions have to play a very, very important role in all of this, in enhancing research, in enabling research. You know, it's nice that, you know, when you come to work for an institution, nobody asks you every day what you're doing. That's great. That freedom is very useful. But then, what sort of research management support is the institution giving you? Do they have a research development office which can guide you for various things? In India, research development offices and institutions are very rare. It's not just a clerk sitting in an office doing the arithmetic on your grant funds. Research management is much more than that. And all of what we've been talking about can be brought under good research management practices. And as a last shot, you know, you may want to tell your librarians that with the nature of work changing, fewer libraries buying books, and in future fewer journals being afforded by libraries, the librarian's job is at stake here. So they really need to retrain themselves in some new things. It's in their own interest to do this.
Thank you so much. All that's left for me to do is to thank the panelists once again for really enlightening us on this subject, including Richard Poynder, who can't hear me thanking him. And thank you to all the organizers and supporters, and thank you to all of you. This indeed, I must say, some of the best audience questions and interactions that I've seen. Very pointed, very interesting questions. So thank you all.
Excuse me. Just a formal word of thanks, very brief. It is my pleasant duty to thank all our colleagues in CPR, especially Shagun Basha and Shambhavi and Obalesh for doing all the work. And I would like to thank our guru and guiding spirit, Professor Arunachalam, for being here today and guiding us through this process of the celebration of Open Access Week at the Institute. I would also like to thank our librarian, Dr. Anand Bhairappa, and his colleagues, especially Francis Jaykant, who are all involved in this celebration. They will also be conducting a workshop for librarians this Friday. And with that very brief word of thanks, I will stop now, and I would like to invite you all to the high tea across the hall. Thank you.
Hey, ಅವ್ರಿನ್ನ ಇಲ್ಲಾರ ಇರ್ಲಿ ಬಿಡಿ.